Welcome to episode 194 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week, we're continuing our discussion of Cicero's On Ends. We're closing in on the end of Book 1, still in the section where Torquatus is finishing his major presentation. Cicero has given his initial objections. Torquatus is now responding. And then next week, and for several weeks after that, maybe even many weeks after that, we're going to be going through Book 2, which is Cicero's broadside attack on everything that Epicurus stands for and everything that Torquatus says here. So what we're doing in preparation for that is we're setting the stage and getting our minds prepared to deal with Cicero's objections, which are going to predominantly be this issue of how disreputable pleasure is as a goal, and how absolutely depraved it is to say that pleasure is the best thing you can search for in life. Now, last week I made an analogy about how Francis Wright's chapter 16 gave us the elephant in the room, in which it's essential to take a position on whether there's a supernatural God and how the universe operates, the nature of things, and whether there are these absolute values in morality or not. That is really an elephant in the room before you even start talking about pleasure. And it has occurred to me to extend that analogy briefly, because as we've been talking a lot on the forum lately about the nature of pleasure, and we've been talking about issues that arise in the discussion, such as kinetic and katastematic, and all different ways you can compare mental pleasure and physical pleasure, and talk about whether one is always better than the other or sometimes, and how you evaluate those. And it occurred to me that the elephant analogy is often used as well in the sense of the blind men who are feeling different parts of the elephant and trying to describe what the elephant is like. And one feels the trunk, and one feels the legs, and one feels the tail. And they all come up with very different impressions by touching the limited aspects that they're touching, all of which are true to the extent that they have information about the parts that they're touching. But the big picture of what the elephant in full is looking like is, in the end, the more important aspect of it. And you have to combine these different observations and perhaps step back if you do have sight and see the full picture of what an elephant is. And so it occurs to me that as we're talking about this, and as Torquatus is going through this here, the emphasis to some extent is on how important and big a picture of pleasure really is. That if you limit it to physical pleasure, if you limit it to stimulation, if you limit it to mental pleasure, if you limit it to any type of mental pleasure, you're not going to get a full big picture understanding of where pleasure fits in the Epicurean analysis. Because from the beginning, when Epicurus was concerned about explaining chaos and understanding the nature of the universe, what you really have to do in order to understand how to live is to decide what standard you're going to follow. And those who suggest that virtue is the right standard, as we were talking about last week, or those who suggest that God is going to tell you how to live, those are methods of organizing your thoughts that can be coherent and provide a lot of people a lot of analysis, and they live their lives by it. But again, we had a post this week on the forum, someone from Greece actually, who's making the point that you need a worldview. You need a method of organizing your thoughts that includes all sorts of details. He was mentioning the pictures that people used to use of Epicurus, and not exactly rituals, but the continuing pattern of activities of honoring the 20th and so forth. You have to have a framework because you can't constantly reevaluate everything going on in your life. It's like Epicurus said, you don't always need the details of the philosophy, but you do pretty much always need the big picture, the outline of the philosophy. So to some extent, I would suggest that what Torquatus is doing here in setting up Epicurean philosophy in its broadest terms is he's stressing that pleasure serves a very fundamental and very wide purpose within Epicurean philosophy. And in relation to that, before we actually start reading 19, we're going to see Torquatus start talking about the way the wise man is continually happy. he's going to place stress on the ability to access mental pleasures and that mental pleasures play an important role in all this. That's a point that our friend Don on the forum has been making, that mental pleasures are often the most accessible kind of pleasures that you can get. Often in life, you're in a lot of physical pain or you have physical disadvantages, but you can usually, if not always, summon up good memories from the past and good thoughts about potentials for the future, and being focused on the present. You can mentally, as Epicurus was doing as he was about to die, he was focusing on the good things and the pleasures that came from his teachings, his friends, his memories of what he had done, and he was offsetting those against the pain of the kidney problems that he was having. That's something that's accessible to most everyone in most situations, and that's an important part of the picture. It's not the only part of the picture of mental pleasure, but it's an important part. And I wanted to relate that to, we frequently talk about the beginning of Book 2 of Lucretius, the part about where it's sweet to be looking out at the shipwrecks and other things that are going on around you. How sweet it is when whirlwinds roil great ocean, to watch from land the danger of another. Not that to see some other person suffer brings great enjoyment, but the sweetness lies in watching evils you are free from. And he continues on at the beginning of Book 2 to say that nothing is more sweet than full possession of those calm heights, well built, well fortified by wise men's teachings, and to think about men who are wandering lost and suffering all of these things that you yourself could be suffering, except for your understanding of the way things are. That would be, I would think, a clear example, not intended to be irreverent or dispassionate towards those who are suffering, but it's intended, I think, to emphasize this point that you always have accessible to you the ability to understand that your life is desirable and that you are living, and that unless you're in some specific pain, you have access to and you can experience all sorts of other pleasures that make life worth living. So that's something that is just stressed over and over in Epicurean philosophy in a way that probably is more direct than some people seem to interpret it. I'd suggest that this whole fixation on absence of pain is not intended to say that there's some exotic, esoteric, fancy kind of pleasure that you can experience if you just think hard enough about it. But it's intended to show that if you do understand what life is about and where your place is in the universe and how lucky you are to be alive, you can experience pleasure and thereby find that your organizing principle, which is pleasure, is something that you have access to just about at any moment in your life. And one more thing I wanted to mention. I would also bring into this Usner 423. This is from Plutarch, and he says, Epicurus too makes a similar statement to the effect that the good is a thing that arises out of your very escape from evil, and from your memory and reflection and gratitude that this has happened to you. His words are these, quote, that which produces a jubilation unsurpassed is the nature of good, if you apply your mind rightly, and then stand firm and do not stroll about, prating meaninglessly about the good. And I had one illustration that came to mind about that. I've obviously never had this experience myself, but you often read about people who are traveling by air, and at the last minute they make a change and they decide not to get on a particular airplane. And then an hour later they hear that the airplane has crashed and everybody on board is dead. Now, a person who receives that news, he's not eating anything stimulating, he's not dancing, he's not having sex, he's not listening to music, he's not experiencing these physical pleasures that people accuse Epicurus of fixating on. But I think that most people would agree that when you hear news like that, you experience such a rush of relief and a rush of gladness that you were not on that airplane yourself. You're not happy that the people on the airplane died, but you yourself are experiencing an extreme rush of emotion that is good and happy for you that you continue to live. That would be an example, I think, of Epicurus using that as an example of your highest possible pleasure to experience something like that. Now, having said that, you would not then spend your time in airports, going on airplanes and changing your mind at the last minute just so you can experience that type of pleasure. You would not seek that out. Some people do, perhaps, Evel Knievel type people who wish to risk things and then enjoy the rush of experiencing the relief of not being killed in a situation. But most people aren't going to do that as an example of the greatest and best way of life or the type pleasure that you need to focus on. It's one type of pleasure, just like the trunk of the elephant is one part of the elephant and the tail is another part. It's much longer and more rambling than I intended to do. But with that, let's start section 19, because what Torquatus says there is a good summary of Epicurean philosophy. For this is the way in which Epicurus represents the wise man as continually happy. He keeps his passions within bounds. About death he is indifferent. He holds true views concerning the eternal gods, apart from all dread. He has no hesitation in crossing the boundary of life, if that be the better course. Furnished with these advantages, he is continually in a state of pleasure, and there is in truth no moment at which he does not experience more pleasures than pains. For he remembers the past with thankfulness, and the present is so much his own that he is aware of its importance and its agreeableness. Nor is he in dependence on the future, but awaits it while enjoying the present. And he's also very far removed from those defects of character which I quoted a little while ago. And when he compares the fool's life with his own, he feels great pleasure. And pains, if any befall him, have never power enough to prevent the wise man from finding more reasons for joy than for vexation.
Cassius, I think that was an excellent summary and explanation of where we are in this text and where we're going to be going, especially as we get into some of Cicero's criticisms of Epicureanism in Book 2. The nature of pleasure is absolutely critical to understanding everything about the ethical component of this philosophy. And this is a really important text for getting there. Now, one of the things I said in the last episode was something that you've been saying just now, is that mental pleasures have advantages that physical pleasures do not. John's example that you can more readily summon mental pleasures than you can physical pleasures, that mental pleasures don't rely on having access to external stimulations right now at the moment. When you're standing in line at the DMV, you can summon mental pleasures by thinking on happy memories and so forth. The misery of standing in that line is not a fate to which you are doomed in that moment, even though you don't have cake and wine and so forth to alleviate yourself. So that's all very important. I wanted to quote something you referenced here, if I can find it, the letter to Idomeneus, which is part of Epicurus's last will and testament. He says, "On this blissful day, which is also the last of my life, I write this to you. My continual sufferings from strangury and dysentery are so great that nothing could increase them, but I set above them all the gladness of mind at the memory of our past conversations." And he goes on to say, "But I would have you, as becomes your lifelong attitude to me and to philosophy, watch over the children of Metrodorus." So even in this intense pain of kidney stones or whatever it is, he still is able to summon pleasures that make that day fully worth living. And indeed, in that last sentence, is able to take other people into consideration while he's doing that. And then as to something else you said, which was the canceled airline ticket, which leads to the great pleasure of having missed the tragedy of the plane crash. That was something that Norman DeWitt latched on as part of his analysis of what he called the summum bonum fallacy. And we talked about that at length in the last series, so I won't go into it too much now. But basically, he says the same thing you said, which is that I think he phrased it that the bare escape of some dire calamity is almost the most intense kind of pleasure that you can experience. And while there are adrenaline junkies who go out and pursue that by jumping out of perfectly good airplanes, for example, for most of us, it's not something we're going to experience very often. But it does serve to prove a point, which is that the need for some physical stimulation is not sufficient to explain every kind of pleasure that there is out there. And you used the metaphor of the elephant to explain that. So that's where we are. And Cicero will go on to say later that Epicurus doesn't understand pleasure. Either he doesn't understand pleasure or everyone else the whole world over does not understand pleasure. So we'll be talking about pleasure and its manifold properties and all of the forms in which it takes. You know, I found something interesting. So one of the things that we frequently hear about in modern life that actually is not as old a question as people might think is this phrase, meaning of life. We talk about, as I was just talking about, the summum bonum. You could talk about the telos, the end or the goal or the guide or the good. It struck me as fascinating that the phrase meaning of life first entered the record of English literature in something like 1834 in a book by Thomas Carlyle, who was a contemporary and critic of John Stuart Mill, which is given a Latin name. It's called Sartor Resartus, which means the tailor retailored. And it's fascinating because what he's actually responding to in this, it's a somewhat difficult text because it has a sort of multi-layered narrative structure, almost kind of like a satire. But what he's responding to in this text is utilitarianism, and beyond utilitarianism, the pleasure principle itself, and of course, ultimately, Epicureanism. And so he says, our life is compassed round with necessity, yet it is the meaning of life itself, no other than freedom, than voluntary force. And he continues that paragraph by saying, as the clay-given mandate, the mandate of the flesh, which is eat thou and be filled, at the same time that that mandate is persuasively proclaiming itself through every nerve, there is a confusion and a contest before the better influence can become the upper. And what is that better influence? Several paragraphs down, he says, love not pleasure, love God. This is the everlasting yea. That's kind of his will to power, sort of an analog to Nietzsche, wherein all contradiction is solved, wherein whoso walks and works, it is well with him. And then he goes on to quote, actually, Zeno here. He says, and again, small is it that thou canst trample the earth with its injuries under thy feet, as old Greek Zeno trained thee. Thou canst love the earth while it injures thee, and even because it injures thee. For this a greater than Zeno was needed, and he too, meaning Jesus of Nazareth, was sent. So the claim being made here by Thomas Carlyle is that this specter of resurgent Epicureanism, he said that the wilderness that 19th century men find themselves in is the wilderness of atheism, that's the problem. We need to find our way back to God. So to that end, he's taking Epicureanism to task here by the expedient of an argument that has become very common, that if you pursue mere base pleasure, Carlyle said that utilitarianism and Epicureanism were philosophies fit for swine, that if you pursue pleasure as the goal, then you are living a meaningless life. Where do you get the meaning in your life if you don't have God? That's become a very common question in Christian apologetics, but it strikes me that that question does not predate 1834, really, in the terms that he puts it in here.
I agree with you, Joshua, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about. This meaningfulness issue is another way of making the same argument that Cicero's making, that all of these other guys are making about virtue. It seems that today there are a lot fewer people, at least in circles that many of us run in, who are overtly religious, who are overtly talking about, well, you've got to do this because God says so. They don't use that kind of argument anymore. But they do use the same argument that Cicero is going to be arguing in Book 2, that he's already started arguing, and that Thomas Carlyle is arguing here, that there's this meaningfulness about your activities in your life that you have to strive for. It's not pleasure. It's not anything that you're going to get enjoyment out of in life. There's something above and beyond that just puts enjoyment to shame. Cicero in Book 2 is going to use the example of a painting or an image that one of these philosophers had come up with, of imagining an image of pleasure in the form of some beautiful woman or something like that, who is surrounded by the virtues at her feet, these virtues who all of us think of as so glorious. Imagine the idea that those virtues would be the slaves of pleasure, and that pleasure is really the thing that's calling the tune. There's just nothing so revolting that just traumatizes the noble soul as to imagine something like that. I think that's exactly what Thomas Carlyle and all these others are saying, whether they put it in religious terms or, and I think Nietzsche kind of went in this direction as well, these humanist terms. Humanism, if you don't watch what you're talking about, becomes this same kind of virtue ethics pseudo-religion. You may not attribute it to God, but if you attribute these other attributes, courage, wisdom, temperance, justice, these other things that become ends in themselves, you end up with this same type of hypocritical exaggeration of the role. Again, the analogy you used, Joshua, you place the cart before the horse. You get things out of order, and thereby nothing works at that point. The horse has to come before the cart, and the person who's driving the cart has to tell the horse what direction to go for everything to work as it should. And placing virtue or meaningfulness or compassion or any of these ideas that do often bring pleasure to us and are worth pursuing because of the pleasure they bring, if you act as if they are ends in themselves, then you've totally got everything reversed. And you end up like Diogenes of Oinoander, having to shout to all Greeks and non-Greeks that pleasure is the end of life and not virtue, and that those who place virtue ahead of it are basically standing on their head. They have things totally turned around. So I do think that's a good example of what we're talking about here. And it's a good reminder because Cicero is going to beat us almost to death in Book 2 about this.
Yeah, another thing about Thomas Carlyle, just while we're on the subject, is that he did have a flirtation with Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism in his youth. And then seeing where it was leading him, he abandoned that and then devoted quite a lot of the rest of his life to opposing it. There was also a figure of the Italian Renaissance called Marsilio Ficino. And after the rediscovery of Lucretius by Poggio Bracciolini, Marsilio Ficino started to write a commentary, a favorable commentary on the poem, and then came to his senses and burned it. And he devoted the rest of his life to incorporating Neoplatonism into Christianity. People are terrified of where this stuff will lead them. And one thing that's interesting about that is they come up with terms like meaning of life or virtue, and then define them in such a way that is favorable to their side of the argument.
Joshua, those are excellent highbrow analogies you brought. Let me make a low culture analogy, because for some reason, given my age, what came to my mind was this song I remembered from the 70s. And it's so trite and sugary sweet, but I'm going to post a link to the forum because I found a version of the video that's a little bit more reputable to satisfy Cicero. But there was this song that was extremely popular in England and the United States. And the line of it that stuck with me then and sticks with me now was, Billy, don't be a hero. Don't be a fool with your life. And the reason I quote that is I think that that's exactly the issue here. If you are following virtue or you're following some type of supernatural religion that does not exist, you are being a fool with your life. And there are times when you're going to be pursuing pleasure. There's times when you're going to be doing things that we call courageous. There's times when you're going to lay down your life for a friend. But you've got to do it for good reason and under the right circumstances, and not just because you're under this peer pressure or this cultural manipulation that comes from these people who say that virtue is noble, meaningfulness is noble, and you must do what's noble and worthy and good. Those things have no meaning in Epicurean philosophy unless they bring pleasure. So we're hitting this from many different directions, and I apologize for polluting Thomas Carlyle with, I believe the name of the band was Paper Lace. So at any rate, don't be a fool with your life is a theme. Make sure that you're living your life based on sound reasoning and sound understanding of nature and not on things that do not exist. Okay, now I'll follow up on your lead that we need to move on. Torquatus then turns to a very, very good section on what we would call epistemology or canonics. It talks about the problems that Epicurus had with the logic of the opposing schools. And there is one thing I want to mention here. We've been talking lately as well about the role of studying the text in making sure we understand Epicurean philosophy. And that certainly holds a very critical role. We were talking in these discussions about studying the text, one part of it every day, as an analogy to something that maybe the rabbis of the world do. And I think it would be interesting to sit back and think about how Epicurus himself is studying nature. Epicurus doesn't spend a lot of time telling us to go study what Plato said about this or Aristotle said about this or anybody else said about anything in particular. I think Epicurus, what he's doing is stressing that you yourself can observe nature and come to these conclusions yourself. So in this section, talking about epistemology and how to gain confidence in your conclusions, that's an interesting thing to think about as we no doubt will go forward with finding ways to study the texts and get more out of them. But at the same time, recognizing that what we're really studying and looking for is not just to be able to repeat what somebody else has said or to say that Epicurus said it, so it must be right. We're trying to understand the reasoning that Epicurus used himself to come to those conclusions so that we can be confident in those same conclusions. That carries us through the end of 19, and then section 20 that follows is another long discussion of one of the main tools of life, which is friendship. We've talked about friendship and its benefits and its necessities so often that I'm probably going to suggest that we move on down to 21, where we're going to begin to close the chapter. Does anybody want to say anything about the
Maybe we can just quote the last line there of 20, where he says, "From all these different views, we may conclude that not only are the principles of friendship left unconstrained if the supreme good be made to reside in pleasure, but that without this view, it is entirely impossible to discover a basis for friendship." That, in other words, friendship, like just about everything else in life, the basis for pursuing it is pleasure.
This is the point of this whole section. Epicurus and Torquatus are confident of their conclusions. They are confident that they are right about the nature of friendship, and that friendship, like everything else, brings pleasure, and it fits into that pleasure framework of analysis. It doesn't need to be pulled out of that analysis. Nothing needs to be pulled out of that analysis. Everything that we find desirable in life comes back to what we were discussing as we began today, that if you're not in pain, it is a pleasure. Not all pleasures are identical. Here's where I can work in something that Godfrey posted on the forum this past week. In this discussion of comparing the pleasures and mental versus physical and katastomatic versus kinetic and so forth, what Godfrey was pointing out is that to some extent, a more basic way of analyzing things is to look at principle doctrine number 9, which gives us an example that apparently a lot of these questions resolve themselves down when you talk about different pleasures into intensity and duration, and then the part of the body that they are affecting. Principle doctrine 9 says if every pleasure could be intensified so that it lasted and influenced the whole organism or the most essential parts of our nature, pleasures would never differ from one another. So regardless of what the ultimate meaning of principle doctrine 9 is, you have Epicurus here suggesting that the duration and the intensity and the part of the body that's being affected, or part of the mind, is a relevant method of understanding pleasures. And then, of course, you go in and apply the whole natural and necessary overlay and all the different practical pieces of advice that Epicurus gives you about predicting what's going to happen to you based on what actions you choose to take or what actions you choose not to take. But the basic issue being, again, that it all fits in the same framework of pleasure. And it's not like that the pleasures of taste are at war with the pleasures of smell or the pleasures of touch or any other type pleasure or the pleasures of the mind. They're all pleasures. They all deserve to be understood. And you just have to fit the choice of which pleasures you pursue into your own preferences and your own context, keeping in mind that mental pleasures are generally going to be available. Understand the situation of life. And if you think about these things, and if you appreciate that God's not going to send you to hell for pursuing pleasure. Okay, so having said that, section 21, which is going to be the final paragraph of this book 1, and it's the last thing that Torquatus is saying before he turns the floor back over to Cicero, and Cicero wheels out these guns and starts shooting with everything he's got. So since this is the last thing Torquatus says, Joshua, could you read what he says in 21, and we'll end our discussion of book 1 on that?
Certainly. Quote, "Wherefore, if the doctrines I have stated are more dazzling and luminous than the sun itself, if they are draughts drawn from nature's spring, if our whole argument establishes its credit entirely by an appeal to our senses, that is to say, to witnesses who are untainted and unblemished, if speechless babes and even mute beasts almost cry out that with nature for our governor and guide, there is no good fortune but pleasure, and no adverse fortune but pain, and their verdict upon these matters is neither perverted nor tainted, are we not bound to entertain the greatest gratitude for the man who, lending his ear to this voice of nature, as I may call it, grasped it in so strong and serious a spirit, that he guided all thoroughly sober-minded men into the track of a peaceful, quiet, restful, happy life? And though you think him ill-educated, the reason is that he held no education of any worth, but such as promoted the ordered life of happiness. Was he the man to spend his time in conning poets, as I and Triarius do on your advice, when they afford no substantial benefit, and all the enjoyment they give is childish in kind? Or was he the man to waste himself, like Plato, upon music, geometry, mathematics, and astronomy, which not only start from false assumptions and so cannot be true, but if they were true, would not aid us one whit towards living a more agreeable, that is, a better life? Was he, I ask, the man to pursue those arts and thrust behind him the art of living, an art of such moment, so laborious too, and correspondingly rich in fruit? Epicurus, then, is not uneducated, but those persons are uninstructed who think that subjects which it is disgraceful to a boy not to have learned are to be learned through life into old age. And then Torquatus goes on to say, I have expounded my own tenets, and just with this purpose, that I might make acquaintance with your opinion, as this is an opportunity for doing so to my satisfaction, which has never been offered me till now. And boy, are we going to become acquainted with, with
Yes.
Cicero's opinion. That is the end of book 1.
At the beginning of book 2, which we'll start next week, Cicero, he goes into this long discussion about whether it's better to have a back and forth question and answer session or to speak in narrative form, as Torquatus has just done. It takes him almost 3 pages of book 2 before he gets back into the real topic of what pleasure is.
He makes another claim here, Cicero, in book 2. He says that Socrates is entitled to be called the father of philosophy, which is interesting because, of course, philosophy in Greece, just in Greece alone, predates Socrates by several hundred years, it seems like. One of the first so-called pre-Socratic philosophers is Thales. But what's interesting about some of these earlier philosophers is that their primary concerns were not the same as the primary concerns of Plato or of Socrates. Their primary concerns were much more in line with that of a Democritus or an Epicurus. They wanted to understand nature, how nature operates on its own terms. They wanted to understand what the primordial element, the foundational element of everything we see, and of course everything that we are. They wanted to know what that was, and really what this constitutes is one of the first attempts to explain nature in natural terms, right? To explain nature as the result of a whole long chain of antecedent causes rather than the result of just one cause, that being the creation by a god. And so even though some of their ideas, like some of the stuff we read in Lucretius, kind of makes us smile today, it represents a really revolutionary approach to understanding the world we live in. And for Cicero here to just glide past all of those earlier thinkers, not just Thales, but Anaxagoras, Anaximander, all of these people, Pythagoras, who were interested in what makes up the world we live in and how does it operate. Is motion possible or is it not? Sort of an argument between Heraclitus and Parmenides. So all these earlier thinkers are asking more fundamental questions about nature than the questions that Socrates is asking or that Plato is asking. So it's sort of the case that Cicero, by nominating Socrates as the father of philosophy rather than Thales, is just ruling that whole line of inquiry out of court, which of course is very beneficial because Epicurus is taking up that thread as a very foundational aspect of his own philosophy.
Yeah, Cicero is being very selective in the way he makes these arguments and these issues that he brings up. The thing that Cicero does to launch off his argument is he says this. The first thing that's important to do is to identify the point that's an issue. He says Epicurus gave his sanction, but the next step he did not see, for he pronounces against any definition of a subject being given, though without such it's impossible to secure an understanding concerning the nature of the point. Cicero says, our inquiry touches the ultimate good. Can we learn what its nature is without agreeing among ourselves when we use the phrase ultimate good, what we mean by ultimate and what we mean by the good itself? And so he's making the point that if you're going to talk about an ultimate good, define what ultimate means and define what good means. Okay, what we're going to find as Cicero goes forward is he's going to focus his attack on saying that Epicurus did not define what he meant by pleasure. Now, having finished listening to and going through what Torquatus says and having done all of the reading that everybody here on the podcast has done in the past, let's talk about how Epicurus would respond to that criticism. What do we think Epicurus held pleasure, the word pleasure, to really mean? What summary of that question are we going to be comfortable keeping in our minds to use to respond as Cicero gives his arguments? Cicero said pleasure in the minds of everyone else means stimulation from the outside to some kind of agreeableness. Is that stimulation of the senses Epicurus's definition of pleasure? And if it's not, what is Epicurus telling us that pleasure is?
I would try to put it in the simplest possible terms, which would be to say that pleasure is not something that happens to us. It's something that happens like within us. It's this feeling of feeling good, of feeling satisfied. I probably wouldn't go much further than that. To feel satisfied or to feel good in the mind or in the body is to feel pleasure. And it's possible that this is something that is subjective because the way that I feel pleasure is probably different from the way that other people feel pleasure. We know, for example, from modern psychology that different people experience different levels of affect, as it's called.
Are there any limitations on the word pleasure in terms of your feelings and experiences in life? Which ones of those feelings and experiences are pleasurable?
Well, the ones that make you feel good, right?
How about, is it playing a word game to answer that question by saying those experiences that are not painful?
Well, you asked what Epicurus's response would be, and his response would be that this whole tangent is a word game.
Or is his answer that pleasure is the absence of pain? Is his answer that pleasure is every experience of life which is not painful? Torquatus has said earlier in what we've read before that if a man is feeling anything at all, he's feeling either pleasure or pain. Is that a word game or is it an attitude?
Well, it's kind of, I guess, what I'm about to say is a word game, because then how do you define pain? Do you define pain as the absence of pleasure? In which case, by the way, your definitions have become circular, don't they? You define one by the other.
In thinking about this aspect of it earlier this morning, I was thinking to myself about the old example of looking at a glass that is filled with water up to the 50% level. Is that glass half full or is that glass half empty? And there is a truth that is understandable from either perspective. But this is something that I quoted this past week that Norman DeWitt phrased it as, that it's not wrong to look at that glass and say that the glass is half full. And would it not be better in life if you take the position that every experience in your life, mental or bodily, which is not painful to you, is pleasurable? And you can justify that on the grounds of saying that, well, you're lucky to be alive. You were dead for an eternity in the past. You'll be dead for an eternity after you're gone. Every moment should be treasured, just as Torquatus was saying earlier in what we were talking about today, that the wise man is going to summon in his experience the memories of the past. He's going to be considering that there will possibly be pleasures in the future. He's going to be savoring the moment. He's going to have all three time periods in which he can consider these pleasures are arising from these things. And if you take this attitude that Epicurus is apparently suggesting, the wise man can live in continuous pleasure, and that there's not a moment in his life when these pleasures that he's able to summon do not outweigh the pains that might be confronting him at a particular moment. So even though you could criticize this kind of perspective as a word game, I'm thinking to myself that this is a lot of what Epicurus is talking about, is that you benefit from and you provide yourself this framework of understanding of pleasure by thinking that being alive, no matter what you're doing, is pleasurable unless you're experiencing some particular pain at a particular moment. That's what Torquatus was saying earlier, too, that we don't agree that just because you remove a particular pleasure, that pain is necessarily going to take its place. Because the default state, or I think the word DeWitt used was the attachment of the word pleasure to the normal state of being, was the major innovation that Epicurus was suggesting about hedonism here, that our normal way of life, our normal experience, the hand of Chrysippus, the host who's serving wine to his guest, the response when Cicero says that, don't you agree, Torquatus, that there's a lot of people who are neither experiencing pleasure nor pain? And Torquatus says, no, I don't agree with that at all, because if they're not experiencing pain, they're experiencing pleasure. And if they're not experiencing any pain, they're experiencing the greatest pleasure that they can possibly experience. This is, to me, sort of an attitude or perspective on life, which you can quibble with and say that this is just a word game. But the people who are quibbling with that and saying it's a word game are the people who are insisting that pleasure means only physical stimulation or mental stimulation from the outside. They are refusing to accept Epicurus' definition that life itself, unless you're in pain, is pleasurable. And it's legitimate to make that argument against Epicurus if you like. But again, I'll repeat, I think that the foundation of that argument would be that you're taking the position that life itself is not pleasurable. And if you think the problem through, you realize that the question is not your place for the moment, but your question is really where you fit within eternity. And you think about what a privilege it is to be alive and not in pain. I think you can summon this perspective through your thought processes that allows you to achieve a life of continuous pleasure in which your pleasures of mind and body and all the things that you're experiencing are seen and understood and appreciated to outweigh whatever pains might be in your way, with the exception that at the end of your life, sometimes pains are going to get so intense and so without remedy that you want to end your life. And at that point, you have the option of escaping pain that way. But that's not the norm. That's an extreme situation. And in the end, while it may sound like a game of words, it's probably, from my point of view at this point, the best explanation of where Epicurus is going here. But that would be one way of looking at the question, I think. Regardless of whether you accept that or not, you're going to be hit in Book 2 with extremely powerful argument that it is only the life of meaningfulness and nobility and virtue that's worth living. And you're going to have a powerful argument in response to that, because all of us are subject to that peer pressure of knowing that if we deviate from that peer pressure, we risk being ostracized and losing our jobs or our lives even under the right circumstances. So you have to have a powerful argument if you're going to withstand what Cicero is about to say.
I had something regarding the meaning of life, that's sort of going to take you in the direction of seeking virtue. Virtue is noble, meaning is noble, and that's just going to end up being the opposite of the pursuit of pleasure. It just came to me that there is a kind of meaning in life in Epicureanism. If you look to the very end of the letter to Monosius, where he says to study and practice these things with others of like mind, and also that the pleasure of the study of philosophy comes at the same time, not afterward, as other pleasures. There's meaning right there and pleasure all at the same time.
What is meaning separated from pleasure?
Well, that just simply boils down to purpose. Does your life matter to anybody else but your own self? We evolved as part of family systems and community systems, in tribes and in families. And so meaning really is something that, if you look at it closer, it's just a basic need to matter to other human beings, because we evolved in this sort of interdependent way. People didn't live in isolation. And so you only have this search for meaning when civilization is getting so complicated and so starting to sever us from our original way of living that we came out of. Civilization creates this missing piece, and then we label it as we're searching for meaning. But I think we know from Epicureanism that friendship is important. Being part of the Epicurean community is important. There is some aspect of meaning, but then you have to really say, perhaps we would label it slightly different within Epicureanism.
Joshua, is meaning an end in itself, or is meaning desirable because it brings pleasure?
See, this is my problem. To talk about a term like meaning the meaning of life is to stack the deck in your favor in the argument. And this is how it's played. It's like when a pharmaceutical company needs to sell a particular drug, you have to sell the illness before you can sell the drug. You have to convince people that an STI or STD is significantly worse than it really is, just because it happens to be on that part of your body. You have to convince people to adopt for themselves this stigma and shame before you can convince them to buy your cure or your treatment. And it's like that with the term meaning of life. People who use this phrase want to convince you that there is a hole in your life. And I don't think that it's true that there is a hole in your life. It strikes me that Colosini mentioned modern civilization, or urbanization, and all of the problems that come along with that. But it wasn't until really after the French Revolution that this phrase comes into circulation with Thomas Carlyle. And it's because of what he says very near that same paragraph in that book, that he is living in a wilderness of atheism. That's his problem. It's not that he's isolated. It's not that he doesn't have friends. It's that he lives in a society that has lost its faith. And so how do you convince people who have lost their faith of the need to restore themselves to that faith? And part of how he does that is by saying what generations of Christian apologists have said afterwards and are still saying today. If you're an atheist, your life can have no meaning. Whereas my answer to that is, I think that my life is just as rich and fulfilling as anyone else's without having to look for that God-shaped hole, because it doesn't exist.
I see what you're saying, that it is coming out of the Christian mind. There still is something going on there, because I think even if you didn't have Christianity, you would have some kind of ancestor reverence ritual. It's very much part of certain cultures that they have a whole ritual of honoring ancestors. In fact, in some sense, the Epicureans really did that.
Calcini, I'm glad you brought this subject up. And I think that what Joshua has said in regard to Christianity, you've just made the point that maybe this is not limited to Christianity. And I think you're exactly right. It's a huge issue. Cicero is making the same argument 50 years before Jesus was born. This is not limited to Christianity. The example that Joshua gave is one that is compelling to us today. But there's something more going on here about this tendency to wish to be, as Torquatus says earlier, dazzled by the glory of the name of virtue. There's something in these concepts of virtue, courage, wisdom, temperance, justice, meaningfulness, that strikes some kind of a chord within people that they don't understand. They don't know whether this comes from God. They don't know what the source of this is. They haven't, as Francis Wright said, they haven't examined the foundation of what it is they're talking about. And they dream up, they dredge up these words like meaningfulness and nobility and worth. And it strikes some kind of an intimidating response in people's minds that makes them think, well, he has to be right. And they think he has to be right. It can't be just life is all about ice cream and cookies and cake and pleasure. There's got to be something more than that. And that's what we're going to be dealing with in Book 2 in extremely persuasive arguments by Cicero. He's going to bring up things about the nobility of mankind and our abilities to do things beyond the animals that will intimidate the person who really doesn't think through these issues, and will cause them to fall away from Epicurean philosophy. He'll cause them to say, well, pleasure can't be the end. I agree with Cicero. I don't really like everything. Cicero's kind of a stuffy, self-promoting politician, but nevertheless, he's probably right about this. And that's why this issue of what is pleasure is so critical. It's interesting. Epicurus does not provide in the principal doctrines a detailed explanation of it. Torquatus says that Epicurus says that no detailed explanation is necessary. But if you limit the definition of pleasure, if you limit your understanding of pleasure to physical stimulation, then you cannot defend pleasure as the ultimate goal of life, because everybody instinctively knows that there's something more than just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The question is, what is there beyond that? And Epicurus, I'm suggesting, is answering that what comes beyond sex, drugs, and rock and roll is the realization through a correct philosophy that your life is pleasurable is desirable in everything you're doing unless you're suffering from pain. That you should treasure the existence of everyday moments. As Don might say, the mental pleasures that come from stable, confident assertions that you've reached these right conclusions about death and God. But every other part of the elephant is just as much a part of the elephant as the trunk or the feet or the tail that we can touch when we're only feeling a part of it. And Epicurus is providing a sweeping global understanding and framework to place all this in, that once you accept the sweeping definition of pleasure as anything that's not painful, you're then equipped to argue against Cicero and the church and these people who want to intimidate you with nobility and worth. You're equipped to explain that Cicero and the church, you're wrong. Pleasure is not just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Pleasure is the true thing that nature has given us to organize our lives. And we're looking to nature and reality and the truth of things, and not to these dreamed up suggestions that don't have a basis in reality. I'm sorry to get wound up again. Martin, do you have closing thoughts for the day?
I have nothing to add.
Okay. Calasini, anything more? Because we're going to come back to your point next week and the week after and the week after. But anything else for today?
I just wanted to add that I think what I'm trying to get at regarding the meaning is not like some overarching thing that you're going to bow down and worship, or some kind of virtue, but something more down to earth, part of human beings, and what's part of happiness for the soul. So I was just imagining, let's say I was going to go to a rock concert to one of my favorite rock bands. And I was like, well, I'm just going to drive by myself and go by myself. Now, I could really have a great and pleasurable time. But imagine if on the way home, my car broke down and I'm by myself, how it would be kind of a drudge to try to figure out what to do and how to get myself and my car back home and to a repair garage. But imagine now instead that I had gone with a friend to the concert. My pleasure may have been just one notch higher at the concert, but more importantly, on the way home, something that would have been kind of annoying suddenly was not so bad because I'm with a friend, we're making jokes about it, we're laughing, we can't believe what happened, but we're working together to figure out what to do next, and it ends up actually being a pleasurable experience rather than being kind of a drag. So I'm just saying that part of meaning is about the people that you're with in life.
Calasini, I'm going to move to Joshua, but I want to say in response to that what you're expressing to me is a part of the big picture of pleasure, just like the trunk and the tail and the legs are a part of the big picture of an elephant. The elephant does not exist for his trunk or his tail or his feet, and neither does a human exist for the single experience of friendship and that type of meaning that you're talking about. It's part of the big picture. It's an important part of the big picture. But anybody who suggests that there's one piece of the elephant that is the elephant to the exclusion of the rest is, I think, going to end up with a lot of confusion and off on the wrong track. Joshua.
Yeah, I'm just going to quote from Norman DeWitt from his chapter called The New Hedonism. Starting on page 222, he says, in passages where the word nature does not mean human nature, it signifies the blind activity of the universe, the sum of all matter and motion, which is non-purposive and almost equally destructive as creative. Both Epicurus and Lucretius personify nature, but Epicurus also personifies prudence, or the practical reason, making a teacher of her. This is mere figurative language. There is no fallacy in the thought. Even though Epicurus affected the bald style of Euclid and abjured figures of speech, there was a poetical vein in his own nature to which he yielded at times. Thus, so far as touches teleology, the net situation may be described as follows. There is no purposiveness in nature, but in the processes of non-purposive creation, she has brought into being a purposive creature, man. For him, being capable of reason, a telos is conceivable. And the next section following immediately after that is the true nature of pleasure. Pleasure is that telos.
And so you're addressing what Calasini has brought up there about meaningfulness and whether there's really an end or a purpose of life, and emphasizing there that Epicurus held that pleasure is that end. I don't want to make our closing just a recitation of Norman DeWitt, but let me go to the other citation of Norman DeWitt that I included this past week as part of this discussion on the sweeping nature of pleasure, because if Joshua had continued a little bit further and gone to page 240, he would have come to this paragraph. The extension of the name of pleasure to the normal state of being was the major innovation of the new hedonism. It was in the negative form, freedom from pain of body and distress of mind, that it drew the most persistent and vigorous condemnation from adversaries. The contention was that the application of the name of pleasure to this normal state was unjustified on the ground that two different things were thereby being denominated by one name. Cicero made a great to-do over this argument, but it really is superficial and captious. The fact that the name of pleasure was not customarily applied to the normal or static state did not alter the fact that the name ought to be applied to it, nor that reason justified the application, nor that human beings would be the happier for so reasoning and believing. So, okay, let's bring today to a close with the suggestion that human beings would be happier if they took the same approach and attitude towards pleasure that Epicurus is suggesting. All right, I hope everybody who has a chance will drop by the forum and leave us a comment. We'll be back next week. And until then, thanks for your time today.